In this activity, we are going to add a responsive navigation. That means the navigation will respond to the size of the device. And we'll finish up a few details and be done with this particular web page. So navigation, we've got it so far as an unordered list. That's a great place to start. And then we're going to use style to shape it and style it a way that it will look like a navigation we want. Making it responsive, we're going to use the best practice to add the code for the navigation in the phone first, so go mobile first. We're going to add that first, and we're going to have a vertical navigation for the phone, and then we'll add the responsive, how we want that to change as it increases to a tablet and a desktop size. And we're going to want those to be horizontal navigation. And we're going to do this all in style. So we'll get down here to where we're looking at it as a phone so we can see how these changes make. I've added a section for navigation here. Now, one thing we notice about a list is that it has default margins and padding. And we love that about lists. We love that they indent nicely, and that works really good. But now that we're going to do navigation, we actually want to get rid of it, but only on our nav list. And so we're going to say, okay, we want to go inside the element nav, and inside there, if you ever have a UL, or remember, comma gives us a second selector, nav NELI, both of them have settings on margin and padding that we want to get rid of. So we'll do margin 0 and padding 0. And then that will get rid of it. And let's go see what happens here. And we refresh, and there it goes. So we got rid of the margin and padding, and notice how they're up there nice and snug, which isn't what we want, but it gets us headed in the right direction for where we want to end up. Now, another thing that we want to do is get rid of that list style type. Now, this one, notice that it went away on that already, and that might be fine. It's still kind of a good practice. Some of the older browsers won't get rid of it automatically, so it's still kind of a good idea to go ahead and add that just for safety reasons, for backward compatibility. All right, so now I've added those two things, list style type none, margin and padding at 0. Okay, now let's go ahead and make those a little bit bigger. So we don't want them all mushed together. So I'm going to set in the nav section in the LI a height, and I'm going to set it at 40 pixels. And you can, I've played with this enough that that's the size I want, but you just pick a size and then you make it bigger or smaller, depending on what you're going for. So if I save that, then notice how these there they go. Now they're all 40 pixels big. Notice how the text is at the very top of those 40 pixels. So I want it to be centered in the height. To do that is I can give the text itself a height by using line height. And that specifies the height of the line that the text is going to take up. And this will it will set that much line height for the text, and it'll put the text in the center of that. So then I can go ahead and get that in the center, which is where I want it to be. Now, one more element that we have to work with is the A element, right? So we have the A tags in there. We want to do some work with them. We don't want them to be blue or purple, and we don't want them to be underlined. So let's go ahead and make some changes inside our nav for the A elements. Notice that we don't want to do it for all of them. So it's important that we always preface it with that nav, so we know that we're inside the nav section that is what's getting this change. So to get rid of the underline, we want to set text decoration to none. And we can go ahead, let's see, what else do we want to do? Let's just start there. Well, let's go ahead and give it a color, shall we? Well, if I do black, so we could match it by doing the black, right? If I do that and refresh, okay, that's one option. Actually, the black gets too dark for me. So another thing that we can do is make it just a little bit softer and make it a gray. So not quite 0, 0, 0, but I'm going to use 3s. And that is going to be a nice, almost black color, but it'll soften it just a little bit. And then let's give it, so now we got rid of the underline and that, and let's give it a background color. So just get a background, And the color, I'm going to go ahead and pick up that same color as the header, which is that blue. And there we have navigation. Now notice something interesting about this. Notice that our A link is only as big as the text. And so we can't, when we hover over, we only hover over the work text itself. So we want to make these A a little bit bigger. And the way that I can do this is I can make it fill up its whole container, whatever's containing it, by setting its display to block. So A's are by default, they're inline, but I'm going to set it to block, and I refresh, and there it fills up the whole thing. Now look how this is just blended into that header. So let's go ahead and put a border around it so that these stand out a little bit so we can see between them. So I'm going to put a border. I don't want it to be very heavy, so I'm going to say with 1 pixel. And again, give it that, I'm going to give it a color. This one a little bit lighter and solid. So something very subtle that I want to be around there. And now they're covered. Okay, a couple things. We want to get this off the edge. So we want to add some padding here. And this is padding on the left. So I'm going to just pick up padding left and set it to 24 pixels. How you doing on this? You getting these all? You can always pause to catch up if you get a little bit behind. And now we're starting to shape up a little bit. Okay, let's do something fun. Let's change the font of this. So far we haven't played much with fonts. And it used to be that you were dependent on whatever font the user had on their machine. So you had to be careful to list what you wanted plus something very generic, hoping that it was on their machine, because what you wanted may not be on there. But that is no longer the case. It turns out now that we can define our own fonts. And I have added a font in a couple font files in the resources, so you'll be able to find them. These particular font files have .ttf. These are small files, and they actually specify what the font looks like. And we can go ahead and embed those. Now, this is something I want to be available for use on the whole page. So I'm going to put it clear up here at the top to add these fonts. And the rule is at font face. And here's where we get to define our very own font. Okay, and we're going to say, okay, the font family name, font family. Okay, the font family, and here we're giving it our very own name. So I'm going to say, okay, the type I have is called Droid, and I can use whatever name I want here. And then I tell it the source. And this is really just specifying where to find that font file. And on this one, you use a URL, kind of like we did with images. And it's right here in the same folder. It's in the resources folder, which is where my style.css is. And it's called Droid sans.ttf. Okay, and then I'm going to create another one. It's going to look very much like this, except I want a bold version of it. And you can download, there's lots of free fonts. You can go look and find. These are kind of like find in colors. You can scoop up a lot of time. And this one is in a file called Droid Sans Bold. Well, now what I have done is I've defined 2 specific font families that I can use. So I want to use this Droid Bold for those navigation buttons. So I'm going to go down here on Nav A. So on those A's, I want the font family to be this Droid Bold that I've defined. And if I save that and come back over here and refresh, there it is. Now I have this nice font that distinguishes my buttons as separate. So I've added this font that I wanted there. And now I can use this font other places on the page if I want, or not. So that's one way to embed fonts in your file using that at font face rule. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now we normally do things, and notice now when we hover that it's all over the entire A tag, and the A tag takes up that whole parent, the parent LI. Now what we want to do is do some things when we hover. So notice it's really common that when you hover, things change. Style changes in a variety of ways. By the way, we've really covered the basics, right? We have turned this list into navigation, and now we can just style all to our heart's content. Um, and, and and you add style, you'll see lots of different kinds of navigation. There's some very clever styling going on. And so the more you learn about style, you can add these to your navigations and do very clever things with navigation. All right, so we want to set up some different style when we hover. And we do that by saying inside our nav element, whenever there's an A and it's being hovered over, so we use this pseudo class selector, :hover, then we want the style to be different. And what we want to do is we want to change the background, and we're going to change it to this darker blue color we have up here in this style. So we're going to go with this darker blue when we hover. Okay, so let's go see how that hover works. Oops. Refresh and hover, and there we go. We get that darker color when we hover over it. Another thing that's commonly done is to add a current page. So notice that we have 3 pages in our navigation, but we're currently on this handling distractions page. And so it's often you'll set that as a little bit different. So to do that, what I'm going to do is actually this style doesn't know which one that is, right? It doesn't know which one of these is current. So we have to manually go into our HTML and go find that nav list, and then we can add, and you can add this class on the A-link or the LI, but you add class equals current, or give it another name. Some people call it active. So go ahead and add a class here, and notice that on this one it's distractions.html because that's the one I'm in. Then on learning HTML, it's going to be on a different link, right? I'm going to go ahead and add it right here. On the learning HTML in this page, oh, these turned out to be, okay. And then on procrastination.html, it's going to be this bottom one. And so each one, the way I'm doing is I manually have to say, this is the current page. And I do that in the navigation. And so now that I've added that, then I can go back to this style and I can say, okay, for inside the nav, if you've got something with the class set to current, right, then go ahead and change that and set the background to something other. So I'm going to set that background to kind of a light color, just a gray, really, just almost white, but just barely off-white. And save that. And now when I refresh, notice that that current one is there. So that current color, and then when I go to learning techniques, the current color is that one. When I go to that, the current color is on the bottom. So another thing is, notice this is an active link and it refreshes it, but I don't want it to look like a link so much because really I don't want that background color to come, and so I want to make a couple of changes. The other thing is I can change this cursor. Let's do that first. Let's change the cursor first. When we're doing that current, right, when we're hovering over the current, I'm going to set that cursor to default. So let's go see what happens when we get there. And see how that cursor is no longer a hand? Now we want to get rid of that background when we hover. So notice that this hover is winning, and that has to do with the selector. This is a more specific selector, right? Because it has 2 elements plus a class. So that would be 0, 0, 1 for the class and 2 for the element, where this one has 2 elements. Well, it has 1 class and 1 element. So if I change that and I add this A in front of it, let's go ahead and save that and see if it wins. Now these have exactly the same specificity, but this one comes after. So we're hoping it'll win with the same specificity and come after. And now when we hover over that, we don't get that background. Okay, so we made the selectors with the same specificity and then the one that came after won. All right, so now when we go, we have a current link. It has a default cursor. It has a different background, and that changes for each page that we added that class equals current on it. All right, so those are the pretty standard things that you do for a navigation. So now let's make it responsive. So when we get it bigger like this, it just always stays the same. And what we want to end up with as it gets bigger, we really want it to be a horizontal nav. And this vertical nav is working great for the phone, but when it gets bigger, we want that navigation to become horizontal. So we're going to do that down here, and we have to decide, do we want it to happen at the tablet level? Do we want it to happen at the desktop level? Or do we want it different? Does it want to be different at the tablet and the desktop? Well, it turns out we only have 3 links, which means we can really go horizontal, no problem on a tablet. And so we're going to make a lot of these changes right here at the tablet section. We'll add some style rules here that we can make changes. And the one that makes it change from this vertical to horizontal is we need to change that list item. So we want to be able to say nav list item. All right, and what we're going to do, the thing that's going to make a change is that display. And we're going to change the display. By default, it's a list item. We're going to change that display to what's called inline block. This keeps it in line in that it doesn't create a blank line before and a blank line after, but it still has block capability, which means you can set the height and the width. And we want that block capability. So we need to have both inline and block, so there's a value for that. So now when we do that, we're still at the phone, so nothing changes. But as soon as we do that, notice we get this horizontal navigation, which is what we want. All right, and it's happening at the tablet level, and then no additional changes happening at the desktop level. So now we have horizontal navigation, and now we can go ahead and clean this up and make it doesn't look quite exactly how we want it, but we'll go ahead and work on it and make some changes to clean that up and make it the way we want it. All right, so let's see. Number 1, let's notice that the width is just big enough for the content. Well, we've got some kind of padding here. Let's go see what we've got there. Oh, that's where we added the padding left, because remember it was right up against the edge. So let's do a couple things here. Let's get rid of that padding when we do navigation, because we don't want to see how they're all offset. So let's go ahead and get rid of that padding. And so we're going to put it back down to 0. Oh, what was that in? That was in the A. So let me get a property down here. So nav A. I'm going to turn that padding off. And then I'm going to set the text line property in this LI. Well, text align to center. So if I refresh, okay, then I've lined those up. Now notice that the LI and the A are just big enough now to surround that content. So I want to go ahead and notice that the content will vary, like some words will be longer than others, but I want my buttons to all be exactly the same. So I'm going to set a width on these. All right, so on this LI, I'm going to give it a width. And 236 works out good for this particular page and these particular links. All right, so now I've got them nicely sized. Now notice here we've got a bit of a margin going on here. And this we got by default when we added it as inline block. And so we really want to get rid of that. And so the way that we're going to do that is to set a negative margin. I can't actually get to inline block itself to change that. I can only get to the LI. So in the LI, I'm going to make a couple of changes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the margin the margin right to -2 pixels and the margin left to -2 pixels. So what that does is it actually, when you use a negative margin value, it actually moves it back into the next element. And there we have them nicely snugged up against each other. So that's great. Notice how our hovering is still working and the style we have set on current is all still working. So that's great that all that stayed. And we don't want to make any changes to that. Let's see what else we want to change. Oh, here, this is kind of something fun. Let's go ahead and put a radius on the top of that. So I'm going to put on the border, right? Remember that this has a border, and I want to do border radius. I want again, we can do, there are several different versions of this. This is the shorthand that lets me do all 4 of them. So I want let's see which one this is. So 0 pixels, 12 pixels, 0 pixels, 0 pixels, and this should do the top right. Let's see. And there we have see that radius we've got? Let's go ahead and do it to the top left as well. And there we've put that radius on the top and left. Again, this is just style you can add or not, right, as you design what you want that to look like. Now notice that what we're getting here, this background white, this is the UL doesn't have a background. We've only put the background on the A tags. And so if we want this to go all the way across, which is what I want it to do, I'm going to add that background color to the entire UL. And I can do this outside of it because it can be that background color all the time. So I'm going to add it, not just, right now I just have it on the A, but I'm going to go ahead and put that default background on the UL. And in fact, I think I can actually erase it here and just move it to the nav UL. I don't have one for just the nav UL. Let me get one. Okay, so I need a selector for nav UL. And I'm going to put the background color there. Notice that we're adding just lots and lots of style rules, and that's part of doing navigation. All right, and then we get that background there. All right, now notice that we have an issue here with the UL. It is not as tall as the LI or the A tag, so we're also going to make it as tall. So we're going to put a height on the UL itself of 40 pixels to match that. Okay, it looks like we need to make it a little bit taller to pick that up, so let's go ahead and do 42. And there we go. And that picked it up, and that gave us the height that we wanted so that it matches. So now that UL is the background in there. Okay, so this is what it looks like in the tablet. Let's go ahead and there's one more change I want to make. When it gets bigger, I want it to be up a little higher. I want it to be more a part of the banner. It seems too tall for me right here. So I'm going to do a couple of things to make this work. And it's actually going to be changing in the header section. So that header changes down here in the desktop section, right? We have the height set to 212. So I want to change that and make it a little bit different. So I'm going to change it. I'm going to make the header smaller. So I'm going to make it 190. I'm going to leave the padding left the same, but I'm going to change the padding top so the words move up a little bit. So change both of those. And now come back and refresh. And notice, and that just makes it look nicer. It's just not quite as wide or big, and the navigation is kind of just moved up closer to it, become almost part of that header section. All right, now we've got our navigation responsive. Notice that when it's desktop size, it's doing that. When it's tablet size, the navigation is staying the same, but the header is changing slightly. And then when we get down to the phone size, oh, look what happened. Remember that we set the UL to 40 pixels? This became a problem because then that paragraph after it went right after the UL. So let's go ahead and move that UL height. We want it to be bigger on the shorter one. So let's go up here and get that UL height and say, oh no, we don't want that to happen there. This is always a good idea to go back and check because things change, right? We don't want that to happen on the phone. So let's go on the phone width. So let's go ahead and just add that down here on the tablet size. So and notice that the tablet size is tablet and bigger because we're not overriding it. So the UL, I had to do a whole new style rule and add that height in there. All right, now let's see if that works better. Okay, now that height is auto, and so it goes all the way to the bottom. Whoop, that worked good. That was almost a disaster. Okay, so now it works on the desktop, that navigation is working, on the tablet it's working, and on the phone it's working. So we've got it set up, working on all of those. We've got just a bit of a, okay. So we've got just a bit of a line right there on that bottom A. We want to work on fixing that. That might come from that background color. We moved it out of the A into the UL. We might need it in both places. So let's go ahead and leave it there and put it back in there and see if that clears up our problem. So that A has that hole. Oh, sure enough, there we go. Okay, so let's leave that background color there and that cleans that up nicely. Okay, now we've got a few things to work up. Here we've got this paragraph that's just kind of at the top of here that looks a little out of place as it just kind of grows and grows. And we have this aside that we need some work. Notice that there's this gap here, and what I want to do is bring this up so it's actually part of here. So I want to make so when it is small, let's just do a little bit of decoration to it. Now, if you notice in the code, it has, that section has class equal to leading. If it doesn't have that on yours, be sure, go ahead and add it. And we're going to add it in the learning HTML as well. So we always have this top paragraph, okay, is the leading paragraph, and we'll style it just slightly different. So in the style then, we're going to say that this leading paragraph, so this is kind of different than the nav, so I'm going to bring it outside of the nav, and I guess we could do it under, where we just say this is for that leading paragraph. Leading actually section, it's 2 paragraphs on one of the pages. And we're just going to do the class leading, so anything that has the class set to leading. Let's do a few things to it. So we want to give it some margin to move it down a little bit so it stands out the top. And I'm just going to do this with the shorthand margin. And I'm going to set the top, remember it goes top right, bottom left. So I'm going to set the top to 24 pixels. And the left to 12 pixels, and the right to 12 pixels, the bottom to 8 pixels, and the left to 12 pixels. And then I'm going to give it, let's see if that just kind of, all right, that moved it away from things a little bit, made that look a little bit nicer. And then I want to go ahead and put a fancy border on the bottom. So I'm going to do border bottom, and I'm going to make this a little bit more pronounced. I want it to be 3 pixels big, dashed, and the color be that orange color. So I can go up and capture that orange color, or since I've already used it, it comes up automatically. I want to go ahead and give it a font family. Right, so let's go ahead and use that Droid font family we added, but not do the bold part. So we'll just add the Droid. And let's center it. So make text align center. And give it a max width. So I could say width, 520 pixels. So I refresh it, and there, it's just kind of dressed up a little bit. And but if I leave that width to 520, notice that when it goes off as I make it more and more narrow, and I end up with a scroll bar. So I don't want to limit it. I want it to say, well, you can get smaller, but I don't want it to get any bigger. So I'm going to say max width. Okay, so that's as big as it gets. Now the next thing that I want it to do is, now when I get smaller, it will stay, all the text will stay there. Now notice when it gets bigger, I want it to be centered. And this is a block element, so to make it centered, remember, it has to be block, it has to have a specified width, and the left and right margins need to be the same. Well, it is a block element. We've given it a specific width, and so now all we have to do is set the left and right margins the same. They are set to the same, but it's holding them at 12 pixels. So I'm going to put the left and the right to auto and let those just auto calculate, and since they're both set to auto, they'll be the same. And then it centers it. So now it looks centered over the when we have the phone size, when we have the tablet size. Okay, and then when we get, there's the tablet, and that looks good. Now we want to work on this section. So what we want to do is move this up here and move this over. So I really want this to only be on top of the first two sections. So I'm going to add a row for this. And to do that, remember that we create a div and say class equals row. So we want to do that so it'll pick up all of our row styling, and I'm going to close it down here. So close the row, and then I'm going to add this as a column, div. Oops, and I want in this first column, I want that whole leading section. So I'm going to put the opening above the section and the closing below it. And I'm going to say this is class equals, and column, I want it to be 8 for when we're on the desktop. And I want it to be 12 when we're on medium. Actually, it's working just fine on medium, on column. We just don't want to do anything. So let's just do it on the desktop. And then notice that we have a row that only adds up to 8. So I want to add another div here. So nothing will float up beside it. And I want this div, it can stay empty, but I want this empty one to take up 4 columns. And because it'll be empty, won't be anything in there, nothing will show up. And there, now this is going to stay centered over those first 8 columns, right? So that looks nice. Now I want to move this up. But notice it's already down here in this row, and I don't want to take it out of this row. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to set its top margin to less, to a negative number, okay? Like kind of like we did with that inline block. So if I go into style and I find the aside, and I only want this, notice I only want this to happen down here in the one that's for the desktop. It's the only place I have to do is change it in the desktop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that aside. I get a selector for the aside, and I'm going to set the margin top. Okay, so I want that margin top. Let me see what I had it set at. Okay, we'll just see if how it plays out. We're going to try this number and see if it works now. 190 pixels. Go back and refresh. Oh, sorry, it said not 190 is not what I want. Well, I'll show you what that looks like. I'll refresh. And it moved it down. I want to move it up. So I need to do the negative 190 and refresh. And don't move it. Oh, it's not quite. There's still something there. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger. negative 191, and refresh. And there, it makes it nice and tight. Now we might change the text on this, and this is going to be really critical. So let's add a height on that as well. Oh, and over here we want to get rid of this margin here. That's the right margin. Remember, that's 15 pixel because all of our columns have a 15 pixel margin. So over there I'm going to get rid of that by going the margin right and setting it to that negative 15 pixel. And refresh. And there we go. All right, now we have that edge looking really nice. And as it gets bigger, it looks good, right? And on the desktop, and as it gets smaller, then that drops below, and this still stays centered across there. And we get down to the phone, and it sounds good too. All right, we've got it all cleaned up. We have a responsive nav bar. We have a responsive main content section. We have a responsive aside section. Everything's looking good.